In the review series, we're going to talk about the civil rights movement, which, while the civil rights movement largely takes place in the 50s and 60s, we're going to go back a little bit to talk about some of the origins and the reasons why there needed to be a civil rights movement. The civil rights movement largely, like I mentioned, took place in the 50s and the 60s. And for the most part, you could argue the civil rights movement continues until today. But really, the civil rights movement, which we associate with folks like Rosa Parks, and discrimination and trying to end, racial discrimination in this country. The goal for the civil rights movement was freedom from discrimination. Now, this country has had a long history of issues with race, starting with the foundational issue of slavery. Slavery was an instrumental part of the American economy when it was founded, all the way back as a colony. And in order to justify slavery, there were racial hierarchies where people were put into different classes or categories until slavery was abolished. Now, slavery wasn't abolished until the 1860s during the Civil War. It would take the North having to defeat the South to ban slavery in this country. And in turn, when we talk about issues with race in this country, it wasn't just the South that dealt with issues of racism connected to slavery. The North also has had a long-standing legacy. So even after the Civil War, it would take a lot of effort to try to dismantle these institutions. And three of the biggest ways in which we see that is through the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment would end slavery. The 14th Amendment gave everybody equal protection under the law. So even if you were a black person and you were in court, you should be treated the same way legally as others. And the 15th Amendment made it so that you could not discriminate on the basis of race at the polls. However, we know that equality was not a reality immediately after the Civil War had ended. We have to remember that in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which took place during the late 1800s, Homer Plessy, who was 1/8 black, tried to sit in a whites-only train car, knowing that he would be arrested. He was trying to get rid of the laws of Louisiana, which banned black folks from sitting in a whites-only train car. His mindset was similar to Rosa Parks. Let's directly challenge these issues facing the United States. However, the Supreme Court ruled against Plessy. This opened the door for Jim Crow. Basically, it said that separate but equal was fine. You could discriminate, which was a horrible ruling. In the long term, it would have major implications going forward in this country. In fact, after this case passed, the United States would find different ways to discriminate against black Americans even at the polls. So while the 14th Amendment was undermined by Plessy versus Ferguson, the 15th Amendment was undermined when black folks tried to go and vote by literacy tests, which prevented black folks from getting access to the ballot. Lynch mobs in the KKK, which tried to intimidate black folks from voting. Poll taxes, which made it so you had to pay to vote. All of these made it virtually impossible, in particular in the South, for black people from accessing the ballot. Now, this did not stop black folks from trying to still exercise their rights during this time period. Even though Jim Crow laws were put in place to discriminate against people, black folks tried to make it so they could navigate around this country throughout the world. And this is where the Green Book came in. The Green Book was a guide for traveling safely within the United States so that black folks could have safety as they went and visited their neighbors, their friends, their families across the country. And this was an effort as an extension of trying to overcome Jim Crow through entrepreneurship. Black Wall Streets opened up around the country where storefronts would provide people with the opportunity to purchase goods. People would open up small businesses in sort of black communities, which were separate from white communities across the United States. If you've seen the movie Sinners, you would have seen a Black Wall Street featured heavily in the very beginning of the movie. Now, one of the most important one of these was in Tuskegee, Alabama, where Booker T. Washington was famous for starting one. But the most famous one was in Tulsa. Now, Black Wall Street in Tulsa was ultimately burned down by a hate group. And this signaled the difficulties of people trying to safely navigate these communities. And after Black Wall Street was developed in Tulsa, it's estimated that over 100 to 300 people died. This was sparked by a false accusation where they claimed that a black man committed a crime. but many were left homeless, the community was left in ruins, and it just shows the difficulties of life for black folks during the Jim Crow era. Now, the Jim Crow era would finally get something that would challenge it with the ruling of Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s. I want to start this conversation, though, by talking about the NAACP, this organization that was created in order to fight back against segregation. It was founded by W.E.B. Du Bois, who is a civil rights activist. And his goal was to try to make it so that separate but equal could get taken down. And in Brown versus the Board of Education, we would see a major victory after young black children were brought before the court, where they were asked questions about two dolls, a white doll and a black doll. And these children, by offering their responses, showed that they had developed an inferiority complex, even by kindergarten. And this made it so that ultimately districts across the country who had been filing these lawsuits would have to integrate. This case overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, which got rid of separate but equal and opened up the door for integration. This was argued by Thurgood Marshall, who would go on to be the first black justice on the Supreme Court. Now, Brown versus the Board of Education had many consequences, including the fact that many black teachers would ultimately be fired. So while Brown versus the Board of Education is a very important moment, it also has some drawbacks we have to remember. We also have to remember that many people in the South were not open to desegregation. In fact, a year after Brown versus the Board of Education, there was a push for another Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education 2, which said that you need to desegregate now, not later. And we start to see desegregation happen at the high school level through the Little Rock Nine, who were met by an angry mob when they tried to desegregate. In fact, even when they were able to desegregate, we talked about the fact that one of the students, Minnie Jean Brown, was expelled from school, despite the fact that she had every right to be there. All of the verbal harassment she sustained led to her fighting back and her ultimate suspension. Now, while we see the development of Brown versus the Board of Education occurring, there were other calls for civil rights due to the murder of Emmett Till. Now, Emmett Till was a kid whose family left the South during the Great Migration. He lived in Chicago, and he ultimately went to visit his family in Mississippi in 1955. Now, when Emmett Till was murdered, his killers, J.W. Milam and his brother, were able to basically walk free because it was an all-white jury and an all-white police force. His mother had the decision and the determination to hold an open casket funeral to call for change in society. Now, ultimately, after this open casket funeral, we would see a call for a wider civil rights movement. And this is where we start to see figures like Rosa Parks and MLK emerge as key leaders. In fact, Rosa Parks, when she decided to sit in the whites-only section of the bus as an NAACP advocate, said that she thought of Emmett Till when she decided to sit on that bus that day and refuse to get up. She ultimately spurred on the Montgomery bus boycotts, which led to, a year later, a Supreme Court case helping to desegregate public buses. We're also going to see Martin Luther King calling from Birmingham jail after he was arrested for crimes associated with breaking Jim Crow laws. He spoke out against Jim Crow and urged that people took steps towards nonviolent protest, where people could ultimately get their rights by challenging laws, by basically breaking them. He said, by breaking the law, we are exposing unjust laws. And this is where we see sit-ins and freedom rides, boycotts, and marches emerge as nonviolent tactics. Now, Martin Luther King would be arrested 29 times, and thousands of his supporters and his organizations would be arrested as well. These tactics, though, were the bedrock of the civil rights movement. And these were tactics employed by groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But not all groups believed in the same tactics. In fact, the Black Panther Party believed in much more radical reform and pushed for much more radical change in society, and did it by bringing guns, for example, to occupied spaces like the California State House. We're going to see other groups inspired by Martin Luther King, like the second wave of feminism, where the organization NOW helped to fight back against discrimination towards women, both black and white. And while these women used tactics like Martin Luther King, like sit-ins and marches, they were never able to pass their main goal of the Equal Rights Amendment. We're going to see other groups like the American Indian movement, like the Black Panthers, take a more radical approach by occupying spaces illegally, by going to Alcatraz, for example, in San Francisco, and taking it back as Indian land. This was a big movement because they were pushing for tribal rights. Excuse me. We're also going to see the development of the Mattachine Society, who fought for gay rights, who utilized sit-ins, like we saw during the Civil Rights Movement with groups like SNCC. And then finally, we have the Young Lords, who pushed for direct action, modeled after the Black Panthers, and called for radicalism. They occupied hospitals and stole ambulances. And lastly, there's the United Farm Workers, who, just like MLK, sort of worked together in large groups holding marches and strikes, who wanted to get rights for Mexican workers in California working on grape farms, who were working under really difficult conditions. Now, this led to some really significant changes over the course of the 1960s, largely through the development of something called the Great Society. Many of the people in power during this time were liberals, who were more open to the government intervening to try to get things done. And after World War II, we were in an era of liberalism with the GI Bill, development of suburbs, etc. Now, when MLK calls for not just civil rights like freedoms, he also wants economic equality. For example, he says that black folks live on a lonely island of poverty and a vast ocean of material prosperity. He's going to really want to try to make it so that at home, the government is focusing on legislation and programs to end racial discrimination, poverty, and address other issues. The Great Society would largely be the program which did this. The Great Society, as a program, responded to poverty and issues with civil rights by passing policies like Medicare. And an example of Medicare as a program made it so that the elderly could get access to health insurance. Because back in 1965, only 60% of the elderly had access to that health care. In addition to that, we would see really big policies like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, both passed to help end the issues that MLK saw as being the key problems facing society in America. Now, that being said, not all parts of the government were open to the civil rights movement. One group, the FBI, for example, targeted civil rights groups with illegal surveillance and tried to disrupt their activities that they tried to have, like marches and other things. In fact, COINTELPRO officials even wiretapped MLK's phone to make it so that they could try to control his messaging and listen in on calls that he was making to make sure that he wasn't doing anything too radical. And another big example of this was the killing of Fred Hampton, who was the leader of the Black Panther Party, who was shot in 1969 by local police in collaboration with the FBI. Now, some claim that Fred Hampton was resisting, but upon his autopsy, it was revealed that he was likely asleep in his bed, which calls into question, why was he killed in the first place? And one last big element of the civil rights movement, which was an extension of this movement, was the fight for sort of green rights and green freedom and economic, or should I say, environmental justice. We're going to see this in 1962, at first with the development of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, where she called out problems like the use of pesticides. From there, we would also see the Cuyahoga River, which was leaked with oil, caught on fire, causing many people to call into question, how safe is our environment? Another big issue was at Love Canal in Niagara Falls, where it was found that 20,000 plus tons of toxic waste was dumped underneath the canal, and a neighborhood and an elementary school were built on top of it, leading to high rates of birth defects, cancer, miscarriages, and leading to people to, just like the civil rights movement, call for change. And this is where we're going to see the development of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which ultimately tried to help better protect the environment.